this is not a huge surprise. We've known that General Motors business in China has really taken it. It's really been hit hard, I should.
General Motors just dropped a bombshell, a massive $2.96 billion loss in the last 3 months of 2024. That's a huge swing from the profit they made a year ago. And now all eyes are on CEO Mary Barra. Can she turn things around? Or is GM heading for an even rougher 2025? With losses piling up, factories struggling, and potential tariffs looming, the road ahead looks anything but smooth. GM had a rough final quarter in 2024. When the numbers came in, the company reported a massive $2.96 billion net loss. That's a sharp turn from where they were just a year ago, when Q4 of 2023 had brought in a $2.1 billion net profit. So what happened? How does a company go from making over $2 billion in profit to losing nearly $3 billion in just 12 months? Well, there are a few key reasons behind this financial mess. One of the biggest contributors was a $4 billion charge tied to restructuring its struggling operations in China. GM had been losing ground in the world's largest car market for years now, and they finally had to take some drastic steps, shutting down operations, cutting costs, and writing off losses. This wasn't just a small adjustment, this was a massive financial hit, and it sent a clear message that GM's presence in China is shrinking fast.
To blame, last month GM leaders warned their poor performance in China would force them to write down assets and take a restructuring charge totaling more than $5 billion.
Then there's the $643 million payout GM had to make for buying out Buick dealerships. A lot of Buick dealers in the US wanted out, and GM was willing to pay them to close up shop. This was part of a broader strategy to slim down their dealer network and focus more on electric vehicles. But in the short term, it was a costly move. Let's not forget the $520 million GM had to write off when it pulled the plug on Cruise, its troubled self-driving robotaxi service. Cruise was supposed to be GM's big step in the future of autonomous driving, but after multiple incidents, including one where a Cruise robotaxi ran over a pedestrian, the company decided it had no choice but to shut it down. It wasn't just a financial loss, it was also a major setback in GM's plans to be a leader in self-driving technology. So when you add it all up, China's restructuring, Buick buyouts, and the Cruise shutdown, it's no surprise that GM ended Q4 deep in the red. Sure, the company still managed to bring in revenue, but as any smart investor knows, revenue doesn't mean much if your expenses are draining all the cash away, and right now, GM is bleeding in ways that should make any shareholder nervous. One of the biggest problems GM is facing right now is its rapidly declining presence in China. At one point, China was a goldmine for GM. It was their biggest market outside of the US, and they were selling millions of cars every year. But things have changed. Sales have been falling for 4 straight years, and there's no sign of that trend reversing anytime soon. Part of the issue is stiff competition from local Chinese automakers, especially in the electric vehicle space. Brands like BYD and NIO are dominating the market, offering cheaper and more advanced EVs that Chinese consumers actually want. Meanwhile, GM's offerings in China are struggling to keep up, both in price and technology. On top of that, GM's factories in China are running at less than 50% capacity. Think about that for a second. Half of the assembly lines that used to churn out GM cars in China are basically sitting idle. That's a huge problem, because when factories aren't operating at full capacity, they still cost money to maintain. This is why GM had to take that $4 billion reconstruction charge. They're shutting down plants, cutting jobs, and trying to stop the financial bleeding before it gets worse. And here's the brutal truth. GM might be forced to close even more factories in China in 2025. The company hasn't officially announced anything yet, but given the way things are going, it seems almost inevitable. The losses in China are stacking up, and GM has to decide if it's worth continuing to fight an uphill battle, or if they should just cut their losses and shift focus elsewhere. To make matters worse, GM isn't just struggling in China. The US government's potential trade policies under a second Trump administration could also spell trouble. If tariffs are imposed on vehicles and parts coming from Mexico and Canada, 2 countries where GM builds a large chunk of its vehicles, the company's costs could skyrocket. A 25% tariff on imported vehicles would make it nearly impossible for GM to sell those cars in the US at a competitive price. And given how the automaker's profit margins already are, this could push GM into even deeper financial trouble.
Over the last couple of years, and now we know to the extent of how hard it's hit and how the company is responding. So it's going to be taking $5 billion, more than $5 billion.
The company once had huge ambitions for Cruise, the autonomous taxi business that was supposed to take on Tesla and Waymo in the race for self-driving dominance. But those dreams came crashing down in 2024 when a series of safety failures forced GM to halt Cruise's operations and eventually shut it down entirely. GM has now shifted gears and is focusing less on running a self-driving taxi service and more on developing autonomous technology for personal vehicles. In other words, instead of trying to compete with Uber and Lyft by offering robo-taxis, they're now working on integrating self-driving features into their own cars. One silver lining in all of this is that shutting down Cruise is expected to save GM about $1 billion per year. Running an autonomous vehicle program is incredibly expensive, and Cruise is burning through cash without generating meaningful revenue. By cutting its losses and walking away, GM is hoping to free up money for other priorities, like improving its EV lineup and navigating the financial challenges ahead. But here's the thing, giving up on robo-taxis might not be the smartest move in the long run. The entire auto industry is moving toward full autonomy, and companies like Tesla and Waymo are continuing to push forward. By exiting the robo-taxi business, GM could be putting itself at a disadvantage when self-driving technology finally becomes mainstream. Another issue is that investors don't seem convinced by GM's new direction. When the news about Cruise shutting down broke, GM stock dropped by nearly 9%, signaling that the market doesn't have much faith in GM's ability to execute its new strategy. It also raises a bigger question. Does GM have a plan for the future, or is it just reacting to its problems as they come? Right now, the company is trying to assure investors that it still has a strong future ahead. GM executives have said they believe their new approach to autonomous driving will eventually pay off, and they claim that their EV business is on track to become profitable in the coming years. But given their track record, missing EV production targets, failing to turn a profit on electric cars, and now abandoning their biggest self-driving project, it's understandable why many people are skeptical.
In non-cash charges, two huge ones in the fourth quarter, almost all in the fourth quarter. Some may spill over into the first quarter of next year, and they're restructuring their joint venture operation in China with SAIC. So here are the two non-cash charges. They're going to write down the value of the joint venture.
GM is saying that 2025 will be different. The company has set a new goal of producing 300,000 EVs, a significant increase from 2024. That's a pretty ambitious jump, and it raises some important questions. Can GM actually pull this off? Do they have the production capacity? Can they sell that many EVs, especially when competition is getting stronger? One of the biggest talking points from GM's Q4 earnings call was that its EVs are now variable profit positive. That's a fancy way of saying that when you ignore things like research, development, and factory costs, GM is making some money on each EV it sells. But here's the catch. That doesn't mean EVs are actually profitable yet. Those big upfront costs still exist, and the company is still losing money overall on electric vehicles. It's a step in the right direction, but it's not the big financial win that GM is making it sound like. And let's not forget the challenges GM is facing in the EV market. First, production costs are still high, EV batteries are expensive, and even though costs are coming down, there's still a major issue. Tesla has a clear advantage here because of its massive battery production and supply chain efficiency, but GM is still struggling to get those costs under control. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.